E seguimos.
And now we will be addressing the effects of digitalization. The question to be answered is, economics is all about disruption? And the next discussion panel will be chaired by Pedro Faustino. Hello, good morning again to all those who are here with us and those who are following the Congress remotely. This last year, a lot has happened in economy, and of course we're talking about disruption. We should also talk about economics, and this affects all those disruptions that we've been discussing: interest rates, public debt, changes in international trade. And I could not have better company for this conversation. We have online Professor Ricardo Reis. Hello, good morning. Thank you for having accepted our invitation. Let me briefly introduce you. Ricardo Reis is a Portuguese economist, maybe the most influential in the European space. He has a PhD from Harvard, and at the age of 29, he was joined the Princeton University and is now in the London School of Economics. So thank you so much again. And of course, I also need someone equally brilliant. I've got with me Pedro Cisa Vieira, the Congress President. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We did not forget everything you did in favor of the digital transition in Portugal. Professor Ricardo Reis, first question for you. After a pandemic, a financial crisis, more recently a war, what can we expect from the economy in the coming years? There are three factors of big change in the economy today. The first one is related with the behavior of inflation, which is very high. But we must understand how catastrophic the past 2 years were. For example, you can buy an insurance against inflation in the financial markets. And when we look at the data 2 years ago of how many people would buy an insurance against the possibility of inflation being this high, we don't find anyone willing to selling an insurance. And furthermore, this past 24 months were catastrophic, but there's a persistent decrease so that we go back to 2%. And monetary stability is crucial because it enables companies. In Portugal, we've had monetary stability for 30 years. Companies can focus on long-term investments. And this monetary instability is a big concern. Second aspect, the real interest rates in the last 20 years in euros minus inflation were extremely low in the past 15 years. And this has an immediate impact since the real interest rate is very low. Long-term returns are more valuable. And when we look at the development of the technology sector, the big stock exchange appreciations are related with very low interest rates because, in fact, the value of a company and the capacity to attract financing today versus revenues in 5-10 years is a lot bigger. Having been very low, and this because of demographic changes, increase of savings, less physical investment, or capital flows from emerging economies to Europe and the US, but it's also related with the fact there was inflation and an instability factor disappeared. And in spite of everything, in the coming years, all these factors are changing. Those who are saving are not young anymore. They're old and they use their savings. And then there's physical investment. We have the risk of inflation coming back and borders that are closing. And with real interest rates that are higher, it will be difficult to have a long-term perspective regarding financing. And thirdly, before concluding, there's a change in the patterns of international trade. And today we not only have an armed conflict in Europe, and it's very difficult to foresee what will happen in Russia, in Europe. But today we also have a growing conflict between China and the US, and it is increasing, and there are news every week on both sides. So there's a configuration of globalization, not with the decrease of international trade that has been growing, but there's a closer relationship or a regionalization within these blocks or continents, together with a remote work. There's a configuration of exporting patterns, and I believe we will come back to this, how 20-something years ago, when China joined WTC and the Eastern countries joined Western capitalism, and the impact this had in the world in terms of our system. So today we're facing a reconfiguration. This reconfiguration is, of course, a reason of concern, and it impacts our businesses, but it brings about opportunities for our Portuguese economies, because this global regionalization that Ricardo was talking about. So Pedro Cisa Vieira, what can Portuguese companies do? They can do a lot. They are already doing it, and I would like to greet Pedro and Ricardo Reis. We speak often remotely, so you've also done your own reconfiguration. Well, the state of play is the following. What Professor Ricardo Reis says is correct from a global perspective. The world economy is being impacted by the contraction of the world trade, the increase of inflation, but their distribution is not even in all the regions of the globe and all the countries. And what we can see is that in this context, Portugal has benefited. I can give you an example. Last year, the exporting of goods increased 21.6%, i.e., in a context where the world economy is not growing or is growing very little, we are increasing the exporting of goods, and also the exporting of services boomed. And I will give you an example which explains how often international organizations, when do their projections for the Portuguese economy, they go wrong. And what are their models? Portugal exports to Germany, France, Spain, England. These are the largest exporting countries. We expect Germany to grow very little, so Portuguese exports will grow very little too. But in practice, exports to Germany in the 12 months that came to an end in February 2023, and this corresponds to the war in the Ukraine, our exports from Portugal to Germany increased 20%, 33% to the US. There's a big change in international trade flows. And if in Portugal, in the past 2 decades, was one of the losers of globalization in terms of the demand for Portuguese services and goods to the East and Eastern Europe, today there's the reverse movement, which has benefited Portugal in increasing its exports, and also the FDI, which has significantly increased, and it has reached record levels. And this already can be seen in the accounts of the Portuguese businesses, and data from the central bank show that the autonomy, the financial autonomy of companies reached 41%, private companies 42%, SMEs 45%, and the weight of financing decreased since before the pandemic, and it was 35% to 30%. i.e., companies have less debt, have more equity and profitability also increased. So given financing costs that are being higher because interest rates are increasing, the impact on Portuguese companies is smaller than what we could fear. So our economic assumptions changed deeply. I believe this explains that in a period of a month, the IMF revised the projections for the Portuguese economy of a growth of 1% in 2023 to say it will be 2.3%. And this means there's no growth in the rest of the year. So I believe there's a large number of changes that represent an opportunity for Portugal. And what we collectively need to assess is how can we make these opportunities concrete so that they're not only a mere circumstance, so that we take advantage of the financial margin, so that we can give a leap forward regarding our position at international level. This is already happening, but I will explain what I believe is still missing. This means, Professor Ricardo Reis, with the changes of assumptions in economy, that doomed combination between a high public debt, a high inflation, and a high interest rate, and this means usually there's a crisis lurking and austerity, or do we have reasons to be optimistic and believe that all these projections mean good news? Well, 1 year and a half ago, I was very optimistic because, as Pedro said, the changes in the world and the crisis are beneficial for Portugal. Remote work means we're not so far away from the main hubs. In terms of the energy crisis, Portugal produces renewable and cleaner energy, and we don't produce oil or natural gas. And also because there's a trajectory of growth of public debt, the increase of the real interest rates, and I believe this will continue in the next years. This affects other countries such as France, and their public debt is increasing. So Portugal does have opportunities, but as Pedro said, we need to take advantage of these opportunities. And I must say that in the past 18 months, and I made several public addresses in that direction, but now I feel a bit more disappointed because I don't see, in fact, a dynamic in the country to take advantage of this opportunity, and this results from the side of the state and the government because these opportunities are not being used, and also because these changes in the configuration of the international market require flexibility and a focus on exports. And here we go back to large businesses and their capacity to grow. But we'll get back to this later on. Let's talk about austerity that you were asking about. The debt is decreasing and it will continue to decrease. And regarding fiscal shocks, sudden increases of taxes, we need stability. Of course, the debt will be more expensive to pay back. But unless there's a big international financial crisis, I don't believe there's a need for more austerity. And after a decade of austerity and paying for debt that we accumulated, and the RRP money is from Europe, and there is also state co-financing. Of course, there was the pandemic, and the state needed to intervene. And in the past 2 years, when we compare Portugal to other European countries, we spent half of what the others spent with similar effects. So we did not squander money in supporting families and businesses. We did so, but we achieved outcomes. And Pedro was just talking about the financial capacity of businesses. We spent a lot less than other European countries, and we need to congratulate ourselves when things are good. Germany spent the triple of what we spent during the pandemic, and the production system in Germany is not better off compared to the Portuguese one. In fiscal terms, unless there's a political crisis, I believe this is not a big challenge, and that's good for the growth of companies and those that are focusing on exports. And Pedro, let's continue within what I was talking about between 2000 and 2010 or 2013, when the world economy is expanding, our exports and their weight on the GDP was stable. And we can see, in fact, the external market and also the capacity where there are bigger margins, and this is what should happen in the coming years. More external challenges rather than domestic challenges. So we have reasons to be optimistic. Professor Ricardo touched upon a topic that is very dear to us, and that's the fiscal side. I quickly made a calculation at home, and someone who receives as a wage 2,000 euros gets a net wage of 1,400, and this person is among the 10% most well paid. People say these are the rich, and I would say that we have rich people, a good percentage of rich people in Portugal. This fiscal burden, is it a limitation for the economic growth of the country, or is this a myth we need to debunk? It's definitely an obstacle. We cannot talk about the fiscal burden as a myth. There isn't a more fundamental tool to change the economy as the fiscal part. It changes the return on investment. It changes the effort of all economic activities that we are committed in. So saying the fiscal part is a myth is not acceptable, and the fiscal part is always important. And there are at least two aspects to highlight. First, the foreseeability of fiscal stability is very important, unless you are not interested in having plans. And this is something that Portugal has not been able to ensure, and I hope things will improve. And secondly, being able to bring together redistribution and not doing what I've called some time ago the expropriation of success. Whenever a company or someone increases her income, is sanctioned with the old taxes, but with new ones. This is a reason of concern, because in Portugal, we need to gain scale oriented towards the external market. And I'm talking about companies, but also highly skilled workers, because they're highly paid. And being this a challenge so that we can give the next leap forward in terms of the qualifications of people, the size of companies, and their capacity to reach out to more markets is a reason of concern, or it should be a priority, so that we don't have, in terms of the size of the companies, so you were saying that our companies are growing and there are sectors in Portugal, namely the technology sector, has been growing. Is this related with our taxation and the fiscal reality? Well, it is important, but in my standpoint, it's not the most important, namely for attracting investment and leading people to have this growth. But I will cover that later on. But I would like to say the following. Ricardo said it's very important to have a trajectory of controlling public debt, but also private debt, because in a context where real interest rates will be higher than it was historically the case. Of course, to control and reduce our public debt to be below 100% of the GDP is very important. Otherwise, what we will have is that if we allow public debt to increase and charge less taxes, we spend more with interest payments. So my perspective is that the priorities should be reducing taxation on labor. This is something that means it should be discussed. There are people who believe that reducing taxation on businesses would be more important, but I believe that the most critical factor for our collective future is talent and human capital. I believe we should focus on this. But of course, this can be discussed. Secondly, Ricardo talked about the stagnation of the Portuguese economy. Often I hear people speaking about this. When we think about the Portuguese GDP in the beginning of the century and what it is today, we see that the average growth of the Portuguese economy was around 1%. This is very little. So we say that the Portuguese economy is stagnated, but I believe this is misleading, because stagnation gives you the idea that nothing is happening. And I believe that in the past 20 years, a lot has happened in the Portuguese economy. There were big shocks that were faced. Globalization meant a huge loss of competitiveness for the Portuguese economy. There were moments of significant contraction of the GDP, so the growth of the GDP went in several directions. It grew, it dropped, it plummeted, and then it started growing. So it's not an economy in a standstill situation. But when we look at the composition of the GDP in 2000 and in 2022, there are big differences. Let me give you a couple of examples. Construction and the real estate sector had a significant weight at the beginning of the century. In the year 2000, it was around 15%. And in 2022, it's around 7%. When we look at the weight of financial services, the weight of telecom, this was significant. And what was targeting the domestic market was significant in the beginning of the year 2000. Now, when we look at these activities, they have lost weight in the GDP, and there was an increase in industry, tourism, and also ICTs. The sector that grew the most, not only as a contributor for the GDP, but also for the exporting of services. So I would say this is an economy with a different structure, and the positioning in the world economy is also significant, and this shows that our companies are being more competitive. What is missing? I believe what is missing first, if we're competing in the external markets and if there's an effort not only to export more, but also our international presence, we need scale. And this is significant. And also, in our industry or in ICTs, the Portuguese economy is specialized on B2B. Our companies sell to other companies. It's B2C. And these are the companies that hold the brand and the direct relationship with the consumer. And this is where the value lies. So we have been growing a lot in Portugal. We're not only producing cheap, as it was the case in the past. Today, we develop products, we develop processes, we're able to grow and to be competitive, but the biggest share of the value is in the direct relationship with the final consumer and the brand. And this is what is missing, gaining scale, the capacity to establish a direct relationship with the consumer using new digital technologies. These are the big strategic challenges, and this will generate more wealth. Professor Ricardo Reis, we have a lot of potential to promote the specialization of production that Professor Pedro César Vieira was talking about, and that's the Recovery and Resilience Plan. What I would like to ask you, Professor Ricardo Reis, is the RRP well designed so that our economy is stronger when we no longer have this RRP? First and foremost, a large share of the RRP, as mentioned in the previous panel, is devoted to public investments, and a lot of it is spent within the state. Although many people criticize this, I don't, because in the past decades there was almost no investment in the state, and in 15 years there was a lot of loss of quality because of no investment in this crisis, and increasing the quality of public administration and recover what was not invested in itself does not seem to be a bad idea. Secondly, the RRP includes many investments that are priorities for certain sectors that can be strategic, and I'm always somewhat concerned because it's difficult to guess which are the strategic sectors. This is very difficult, and I believe that money is better employed when we're talking about establishing conditions, structures, infrastructures. In the RRP, we don't find much about digital investments, and if you are in a train and you don't have internet connection, or when there's regional inequalities and you don't have a good internet coverage, I believe this is a priority that is not in the RRP. But thirdly, and maybe this is the most important, the RRP will be applied, and the success of the plan depends on the quality of the implementation, and this cannot be seen in a plan. So let me give you a couple of examples of this need of quality. First, when we talk about the education sector and talent, and this has already been mentioned several times in this conference, Portugal, in the past 30 years, up until 2010, 2015, there was a big effort for the schooling of our population. We look at 2015, and people with less than 40 years, we have a high level of education as most countries. So, in the past 7 years, if I mention what was the biggest failure of the current government in the past 5 to 6 years, is the incapacity to redirect the education system from quantity to quality. A leap forward to quality is very important, and to improve the quality of education rather than the quantity of education, and this needs to be done step by step. Secondly, institutions in Portugal and the capacity to follow the execution, implementation, to test and to learn from past lessons when we're talking about the implementation of the RRP, and to understand what worked in the past 3 months and to change. And the follow-up committee should be more dynamic, should have more intervention capacity. It's not useful to say that things went wrong or what went wrong 6 months ago, but rather to correct the allocation of resources. So this flexibility is important. Thirdly, and to use an analogy that I hope you understand, when we're talking about economic growth, we're talking about more skilled workers, we're talking about more available capital, and in this case, the RRP plays a very important role. We're talking about better technology, meaning access to revenues. I'm sorry, Ricardo, we need to finish. We have a computer software, a program, but we need the compilation that uses the software and translates the coding of the applications. In this case, there are many failures, and this is where I see the need for large companies to grow because they have better compilers.
Can I make a comment? There's a topic we need to address. That is, we choose not to have anything on digital connectivity in the RRP. We have a national program to cover white zones with national amounts, but indeed, Portugal has an excellent digital coverage, much more than any other European country. And it's normal that a significant part of the RRP was used for optical fiber because in other countries like Germany and others cannot be compared. And the quality of our telecommunications is a competitive factors as we are seeing it. When you look at the input, digital coverage in Portugal is very good, but the grid's capacity outside urban centers, we have an average performance. This is what I meant in terms of quantity and quality when I spoke of the difference. I'd like to ask a provocative question, and I accept you to be evasive. And speaking to a minister of the economy, if you were convened to other functions, would you be available? I'm not going to answer. No, I'm not going to answer your question. But thank you for your praise.
Fazemos.
We will now have our coffee break after finishing this debate. Please don't forget to use the Congress app. We will be back in 30 minutes to talk about quantum communication and cybersecurity.